In February, Russia's President Vladimir Putin called it a special military operation, as he continues to do. But for most of the established democracies of the world, particularly in the NATO alliance, the attack on Ukraine clearly amounted to an appalling and unjustifiable war. Against the odds, Ukraine is still fighting. Let's find out where things stand. With us now for their insights, and as is our custom here, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital with Rafal Rohaczynski, Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a principal of the SecDev Group, where he leads its geopolitical digital risk practice. In Windsor, Ontario, Alexander Wanoshka, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo and author of the newly published book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century. And in Oshawa, Ontario, Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University and author most recently of Stand on Guard, Reassessing Threats to Canada's National Security. It's great to have you three on our program tonight to check in on a story that is day by day increasingly distressing. And I think we want to start here. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this map here of the conflict zones in Ukraine. And apologies to those of you listening on podcast. I'll do the best I can sort of describing the state of play in Ukraine right now. But it's better to see this, obviously. The blue dots on the map, and there are blue dots on the southern eastern coast of Ukraine and in the northeastern coast of Ukraine. Lots of blue dots, which indicate significant fighting over the past 24 hours. That's what the blue dots are. Now, if we go to the red and white striped area, which is just south of Luhansk, and then in the very southeastern part of Ukraine, we see Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory before February 24th. So that's in advance of the war. Now, if you look at the orange striped area, that's assessed as Russian advances in Ukraine, the orange area. And there's lots of that north of Luhansk, and then from Kherson to Mariupol in the southeast. And then there are a couple of splotches of brown just south of Donetsk and another very small one near Kherson, and that's been assessed as Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory. So those are the four different areas, all of which are in the eastern and southeastern part of Ukraine. And Alex, maybe you could get us started on sort of analyzing the significance of all of this. We were told, obviously, off the top that Kiev was going to fall in 3 days. Obviously, that hasn't happened. The Ukrainians are doing so much better than anybody anticipated. Tell us, based on your knowledge, how well you think they're holding up so far.
I think they're holding up reasonably well, considering the circumstances. I think we're entering a fairly difficult stage, however, for Ukraine. After all, the map doesn't quite give you a good sense of the distances involved, but this is a country that would span in North America, the area between Chicago, Toronto, Raleigh, and New York City. And so the terrain, especially in the east and the south, are flat. It lends itself fairly easily for maneuver. Russia was able to take up a lot of those territories along those vectors. And so what we're seeing, especially in the south, is the effort on the part of Ukraine to regain parts of the Kherson Oblast. Indeed, there are recent reports of the Ukrainian armed forces advancing closer to the city. However, in the east, in the Luhansk Oblast, a lot of the heaviest fighting are being seen as of the moment in Severodonetsk. It is assessed that Russia has control of most of that city, but Ukraine is trying to attrit as much as it can of Russian forces. It is not as strategically important for Ukraine as it is for Russia. For Russia, Severodonetsk is important because it guarantees the control of the Luhansk Oblast, but it does provide an important opportunity for Ukraine to, again, attrit Russian forces, to hold them at bay, and to curb further advances into eastern Ukraine.
Stephanie, let's talk casualties for a second. I have seen figures that suggest Ukraine is losing 100 people a day. How about on the Russian side of things? Do we know what their casualty and wounded rate is?
So we don't. We do have some estimates, some from the Ukrainians themselves. Most of the analysts I've seen commenting on this suggest that those numbers are likely exaggerated, and we should be very cautious. I mean, the Ukrainians, of course, are on the ground and definitely have some insights as to the loss rates of the Russian forces. But we have seen estimates that potentially up to 20,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in this conflict, which is an astonishing number if you think about it. Far more than what the Russians actually lost in their fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So their attrition rate does seem to be relatively high, but this is something they seem very, very determined to keep going. There has been some estimates as well. I mean, where Ukraine has the advantage is in manpower, but not necessarily equipment. Russia has the advantage in equipment, but not necessarily manpower. While they have a conscript army, there's an agreement that the conscripts are not supposed to be fighting in this war, right? So the people who are fighting are what's called contract soldiers. These are our people. It's kind of like our volunteer-based army. And Russia has been trying to recruit more and more individuals, offering large amounts of money for short periods of contract fighting for individuals with military experience. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that the losses on both sides are pretty grave.
Rafal, let's talk about your area of expertise, which is cyber and cyber war. Cyber war, interestingly enough, hasn't so far been as dominant on the battlefield, if I can use that metaphor, as many had suspected it would be. And you helped Ukraine invest in its internet infrastructure back in the day. I wonder if you can tell us how effectively Ukrainians have employed cyber warfare methods so far.
Well, it's a great question, Steve. And I think it comes back to the fact that this is the first war where cyberspace is actually part of a conflict between two industrialized powers. And to say that cyber hasn't played a role is to sort of misstate the case. The reality is that Ukraine came under a fairly significant cyber attack in the opening days of the war, including an attack against a satellite provider, which basically knocked out not just satellite services in Ukraine, but for most of Europe. I think the significant that we've seen this, however, has been the use of cyber military capabilities. And these are something that we haven't seen in previous conflicts, but really have accounted for the fact that Ukraine's relatively lightly armed forces have done significant damage to a $1 trillion investment made in the Russian military over the last decade. The fact that we've seen over 12 general staff officers targeted and killed in artillery strikes, the fact that we've seen significant losses against frontline Russian troops, can be attributed to the fact that we have intelligence that uses cyber means in order to target that. Secondly, we've had cyber now playing a much more global perspective. We've had economic sanctions, which have targeted Russia's ability to use basic IT and programs that are necessary for its military production, and which in the long term are going to have a significant impact in reducing its ability to generate the kind of force that we'll need if it's going to meet the minimum objectives that it has for Ukraine at the moment.
A quick follow-up, though, Rafal. Would you say that, and I guess the comment I made off the top refers to actually a previous program that we did here, where the guests suggested that cyber was not as significant a part of the battlefield as they expected it would be. And so my follow-up is, in spite of what you say, it hasn't been decisive yet, has it?
It's not been indecisive in the way that we maybe expected cyber war to be. Even a few months ago, when we thought that this would be hoodied hackers taking down critical infrastructure within cities. That's not the way that it's played out. We've seen cyber on the battlefield, but we haven't seen it used in the way that it was prior to the conflict, mainly as a weapon of mass distraction rather than destruction.
All right. Stephanie, I want to come back to not necessarily cyber war, but actual long-range weaponry, which the Ukrainians are asking NATO for. And obviously, NATO has got to weigh the pros and cons of doing so. Maybe you could lay out the arguments for us on why we either should or shouldn't supply the Ukrainian army with long-range weapons.
Well, it's not even so much the willingness to do so. I think that there is an understanding that, or at least we saw earlier this month, that there's an agreement between Ukraine and the United States that if these long-range weapons are used, they will not be used against Russian territory. And I think that's always been the concern for NATO states in this entire conflict is escalation. It's one of the reasons we haven't seen NATO forces provide planes, for example, to Ukraine, because there's concern that, if NATO is seen as doing so, it might just be a little too much and it could provoke a much stronger response from Russia. So that's I think that the main consideration is avoiding escalation. But there's so many other factors here as well. I mean, at first, what we saw was a lot of Eastern European states giving their kind of Soviet era equipment to the Ukrainians because, of course, they were familiar with those kinds of weapons. And as they're asking for these more sophisticated devices, there's a lot that goes there. I mean, you can provide these weapons, but do the Ukrainian forces know how to use them, right? So then you're kind of trying to frantically train them. You can provide a lot of equipment, but do they have the trucks and infrastructure necessary to actually bring those pieces of equipment safely to the battlefront? That's another issue here as well. So there's so many other factors in terms of just, it's not so much of just simply providing weapons, it's also ensuring that, the Ukrainians, if you're going to go this route, if they can actually use them in an effective way. And secondly, can they actually get them to the front? And these are the things that I think are kind of the choke point right now. We're hearing a lot of Alex spoke a lot about the fighting that's happening in the east of the country. A lot of that, this is why we're hearing the Ukrainians put more and more pressure on the West, I think, for weapons. But it's not, we can't just dump them on them, even if we want to. It's a matter of training, getting them the, tech support even is a huge issue. And then also if they can even get those weapons to the front line safely.
Alexander, I want to get your view on this. Do you think it's fair for NATO to ask the Ukrainians, who, after all, are fighting for their lives and the future of their country, is it fair to ask them to put these conditions on NATO's providing long-range weaponry to them?
I think it's very tricky because Russia has been launching air and cruise missile attacks from Russian territory. And so Ukraine is forced to fight with one hand tied behind its back. And indeed, this has been an issue since the very beginning of the so-called special military operation since February 24th. I understand the reasons for concern with respect to escalation. I think Ukraine itself is very attuned to those risks too. That being said, they have launched attacks on Russian territory, especially in and around Belgorod, and it does not appear that those attacks have precipitated some major Russian military response that would mean further escalation. So the escalation question is very tricky. The concern is real. There are many who do share them, but I think we have seen Russia not exactly act on particular threats to escalate over the course of this particular conflict, despite increasing amounts of Western military assistance to Ukraine.
Rafal, I mean, this may be an overly simplistic question, but clearly Russia has no problem attacking Ukrainian territory. Why should we put the handcuffs on Ukraine and prevent them from attacking Russian territory?
Well, this is a really interesting question if we look at cyberspace, because unlike the weapons that are used in kinetic space, cyber weapons, frankly, respect no borders. And one of the interesting features of this conflict has been Ukraine's very successful crowdsourcing of cyber attacks against critical Russian infrastructure. This has been ongoing over the last 100 days, has taken offline most Russian government websites, as well as some critical infrastructure, and in fact, prompted the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, to state that if space assets were attacked by cyber attack, then Russia would respond up to the level of escalation as if it was being threatened for its existence. Russian military doctrine, interestingly enough, makes very little distinction between the use of cyber weapons or nuclear weapons as they pertain to the national security of Russia. And there's a very, very big legal question right now whether or not the West's support for cyber attacks against Russia, even though this is largely a kind of a support that doesn't limit individuals from joining in these kinds of cyber attacks, whether that makes them effectively co-belligerents in the conflict at a much higher level than through the supply of arms. So this is an interesting question that I think is going to unfold as this conflict continues.
Stephanie, let me get you to weigh in on how do you see the cyber war going so far?
It's interesting when we say cyber, what do we mean? There's so many different kind of aspects, and obviously we've heard quite a few of them, whether we're talking about the actual ability to take critical infrastructure offline, whether we're talking about the ability to just even maintain the internet in Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine didn't lose, I think one of the things we all thought would happen within the first 72 hours is Ukraine would lose control over its communications. that never happened. I mean, we can have a debate to the extent that Elon Musk is responsible for that in terms of providing internet satellite. And I'd be interested in hearing the other speakers on that. But there's other aspects to this as well. We heard, for example, the electronic warfare aspect of this, which is, the ability to actually target some of the commanders on the ground because they're using unencrypted communication devices. This has been a huge failure on the Russian side, is to provide secure communications to its forces, and it's enabled, I think, some of the targeting, particularly in the early stages of this operation. And the final aspect of this, to me, that's really interesting is the information aspect of this. We've heard for years talk about hybrid warfare, the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which, there's a military analyst, Michael Kaufman, he calls it the junk drawer of ideas. But this idea that Russia could actually dominate the information space and help induce kind of a surrender mentality of the enemy, that they would be able to come in and dominate communications. And this really didn't happen. And that's one of the really curious puzzles to me of this entire, special military operation. The fact that, a lot of the Russia, at least in Ukraine and certainly in the West, has not been able to muddy the information waters. There's some, speculation and some concern that, Russia is winning the information war in places like China, places like Asia, places like Africa. But by and large, I think there's a pretty clear global narrative that Russia invaded Ukraine, that, this is, a lot of the turbulence is the fault of this invasion. And where we go from here, I'm not entirely sure. We may see Russia improve its information operations as we go through this conflict, as it does actually manage to make gains in the east of the country. But that's yet to be seen.
Rafal, I can't let that Elon Musk comment go by without getting you to comment on that. Has Elon Musk played a role in this war?
I think he has. I mean, it's clearly that Starlink has provided capabilities that otherwise weren't available. But I think there's a bigger story here, too. Look, let's not forget that since 2014, Ukraine has been the most targeted country in the world in terms of state-based cyber attacks, whether that's attacks against critical infrastructure that made the lights go out in Kiev twice, whether it's malware that was introduced into the financial system that basically locked up pretty well at every point of sale in Ukraine at one point in time. Industry has stepped up. Microsoft and other companies have used effectively Ukraine as a training ground for some of their more advanced techniques. We've seen very quiet but very effective assistance through the U.S. Cyber Command in ensuring that critical aspects of the infrastructure would not go down in terms of the conflict. And finally, you've seen Ukrainians themselves, who are, let's not forget, a pretty technically sophisticated nation, take steps to make sure that the infrastructure would continue operating. The last point, I think, goes to Stephanie's, is the fact that this whole invasion, let's not forget, going back to February, was a pretty hubristic exercise on the part of the Russians. It's pretty clear now that there wasn't really good operational planning. And at least the first wave of the invasion was going to be seen as a triumphal drive through Kiev with welcoming crowds, effectively calling for a change in regime. The fact that we had very little electronic warfare is only one of the many pillars of a successful and well-planned military operation that was entirely absent in February and only belatedly has started to be put into place in the much more narrow and much more difficult fighting in the Donbass.
Alexander, I want you, if you would, to start us off in some discussion about Ukraine's allies right now. And by that, I mean inflation is really very problematic right now. Gas prices, I don't have to tell anybody watching this or listening to this what they're doing right now. There's a global wheat shortage because farmers can't get their crops going out of Ukraine right now. What kind of pressure is this war putting on Ukraine's allies, in your judgment?
It's putting a lot of pressure. I think, though, we have to make distinctions among the partners that Ukraine does have. Those closest to it, namely Poland and the Baltic countries, as well as the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada, for that matter, have been pretty good at providing bilateral assistance, as well as various forms of military assistance. Indeed, those countries in NATO closest to Ukraine have been very good at providing Soviet military equipment. And indeed, they are concerned, as the Ukrainians are, that Western geostrategic attention will dissipate and that there will be a growing sense of the need to put pressure on Ukraine to come to some sort of ceasefire, to get back to business as usual with Russia. That certainly may be the case in some parts of Western Europe. There was a recent poll indicating that concerns over peace might actually triumph over concerns over justice with this particular war. But it's not entirely clear how decisive such public opinion polling might actually have on decision makers. Indeed, France has actually been fairly clear in recent days that it does want Ukraine to prevail, to win, to restore its territorial integrity, and that indeed the French economy will do what it can to help service Ukraine's military needs. So it's very much up in the air. I think the fact that we're actually having this conversation is testament to the fact that we are still keeping attention on this particular issue, and that it might not be dissipating at the rate of that has many people concerned.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, Alex, and that is, do you think it is actually part of the mission by Russia to create a global famine in its efforts to defeat Ukraine?
I think that's a reasonable statement to make at this point. Indeed, the head of the African Union had met with Putin not very long ago, adopted very politically neutral language, asking about how Russia could provide relief. And then the very next day, Russia targeted grain terminals that indeed further compound the issue that we're seeing with respect to food insecurity and grain shortages. It might be very difficult in the absence of direct documentary evidence to identify this particular motivation, but the tactics being used by Russia, some of the behavior that we have been seeing on the part of Russia, not least involving the theft of grain and trying to ship them to destinations in North Africa, do show that Russia is indeed trying to weaponize food insecurity for its own strategic gain.
Stephanie, I mean, it's not like Russia hasn't in the past tried to create famine in countries. They tried it in Ukraine, obviously under Joseph Stalin. But do you think it's accurate to say that part of the mission here by Russia is to create global food insecurity?
So I have to agree with Alex that, without direct proof, it's hard to know exactly what Putin is thinking. I think what we can say is that if there is a famine as a result of his invasion of Ukraine, he does not seem to be too bothered by it. And certainly he does not seem to be looking for solutions. The concern right now, of course, is that there are mines around Odessa, right? And those mines have been placed there by the Ukrainians. And, so basically the problem is we can't get ships to those ports. And the problem is as well is that there's not enough rail capacity in Ukraine to get all the grain that's there, that's been harvested, out to global markets. So really the most efficient and best way is through these ships. But, Ukraine doesn't want to remove the mines for a number of reasons. I mean, even if Russia is unable to invade some of the ports in either Odessa or the other parts of the country, that the fact is that they will not be, there's concern that if they remove their mines, that the Russians will just simply replace them with their own mines. There's also problems with regards to ensuring shipping and things like this. So, I mean, this is the other part of the story that we do hear less about is that, the economic devastation on Ukraine as a result of this conflict is going to be bad. The global impact of this is going to be bad. We focus so much on the Russian sanctions and whether or not they're working that sometimes I think that we're not seeing just, this other side of this conflict, which is that, just how hard it's going to be for the Ukrainian people to really live through, the winter of 22-23.
Alexander, can you help us understand this? Because, presumably every country around the world, even Russia, wants to make friends. Why would it be in Putin's interest to create a global food shortage, which presumably most of the world would put at Putin's feet?
I think he believes that in so doing, it would put pressure on the part of Western governments that would to induce pressure on Ukraine to come to some sort of ceasefire agreement that'll be favorable to Russia. And indeed, Ukraine has resisted those sorts of calls precisely because it feels quite reasonably, in my view, that any such ceasefire would largely benefit Russia insofar as it provide the opportunity to regroup, to reposition itself, and to reconsolidate its military forces. So Putin is happy to perhaps take the blame because at the end of the day, what's really important for him is to try to consolidate territorial control over Ukraine and to split Ukraine away from its Western partners.
Okay, let's talk sanctions. Rafal, get us started here. I know there was certainly a sentiment a while ago that said Russia's making a fortune selling its gas all over the world, so let's just not buy their gas and starve them out. And obviously, there are too many Western economies that depend on that. so that strategy was not available. Having said that, are there other sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia that actually do have teeth and are working?
Well, this is, again, a great question. It ties into your last one. We have to be mindful of the way that the Russians narrate this conflict as well. And although they've been careful in terms of calling it a special military operation in order to emphasize the fact that this is their sovereign right and that they don't recognize Ukrainian sovereignty over the territories that they're currently fighting over, they really do see it as a global conflict. And economic sanctions against Russia and responses to those sanctions, including the weaponization of food deliveries, is seen as basically fair target and fair game. Now, on the sanctions questions in Russia, there have been a number of ways that this has really affected things and continues to do in Russia, one of which is the sanctions that have been put against IT industries. Again, getting to the point of the effectiveness of cyber war, it takes millions of dollars and a lot of skill to create malware that can attack a banking system, for example. However, if you withdraw a license agreement for Oracle, you can disable 400 banks in Eurasia pretty well overnight. And the Russians are very mindful of this. So they see the weaponization of economic sanctions as yet another front that the West can use and are taking pretty considerable steps to try to minimize their losses. The challenge, of course, is that especially in the tech industry, and whether we're talking software or talking hardware, it is a monopolized global industry. Russian military buys most of its microprocessors from a single plant in Taiwan, which means that the vulnerabilities are there both for us to exploit as well as for the Russians to respond against. And as a result, this tit for tat of economic sanctions, weaponization of food versus sanctions against Russia's IT industry, as an example, is something that we can expect to unfold as this conflict protracts.
Less than 4 minutes to go here. And Stephanie, let me get you to follow up in this regard. I mean, we've seen the Canadian government sanction Russians in one particular way, such as to say, here's a list of people that are no longer allowed to come from Russia to Canada. And I can just imagine the Russians are quaking in their boots at the thought that, oh my goodness, poor us, we can't travel to Canada anymore. So, I mean, have we actually put any sanctions in place that have got any teeth?
Yeah, actually, and in some ways, we've actually been leading some of the ideas about sanctions. And under our current legislation, we actually have the ability to not only seize funds in Canada of Russian or Russian-affiliated organizations, and then we can give that money actually back to Ukraine.
But have we done it? We can do it. Have we actually done it?
We have seized the assets, absolutely. But I think the bigger issue here is that we do actually lack sanctions enforcement. And this is one of the things that kind of drives me bananas. And maybe we can do a whole other episode about. But, we can say, OK, these people can't come here. They can't use Canada for their banking services. They can't buy Canadian products, all these kinds of things. But we actually don't really have the capacity to enforce these mechanisms. And I think that's a real issue. It's that it's very hard for Canadian authorities to actually follow the chain of money, of people. And so, for example, if someone is ordering Canadian goods through Dubai, for example, they may very well get away with it because we just can't do that follow up. So I think one of the big things we need to do as a result of this conflict, and really just to be a good international citizen, is to actually put more capacity behind our sanctions regime. We have the laws. We just actually need the kind of manpower and resources to enforce them in a much bigger way.
Alexandra, I want to put to you one of the long-standing maxims that one hears about the former Soviet Union then and now Russia today, which is never underestimate the ability of the Russian people to sustain considerable amounts of suffering for long periods of time. If that is the case, is that Russia's ace in the hole to eventually win this war?
Well, I think we have to take a fairly broad view of what sanctions do. So sanctions may simply punish and reinforce red lines, as well as to denounce certain actions that have already happened. But, and this is something that Rafa had already mentioned, they do have an effect, maybe not so much on getting the population to rise up against the Kremlin. That I think is a tall order in this particular scenario, but to have fairly diffuse effects on the ability of the Russian military-industrial complex, if I could dare say that phrase, to deliver particular technologies or particular armaments. So, for example, what we're seeing already is Russia not having precision technologies that it can use on the battlefield for maximal effectiveness. Indeed, it seems to be fairly low in its stocks of precision-guided munitions. And indeed, a lot of the artillery strikes that Russia is undertaking to this day lack precision and lack accuracy in a way that is fairly helpful for Ukraine. And indeed, the sanctions put on Russia since 2014 have been useful for attriting various aspects of Russian military modernization in a way that, again, has benefited Ukraine. So I don't want to make any statements about the robustness of Russia and how Russians can go about suffering. That can get a little essentialist, if I may. But I think there are these very important effects that do take time to be felt, and those effects can still matter insofar as can tilt the balance of probabilities in favor of Ukraine.
Rafal, let me give you the last 30 seconds on that issue. Are the Russians depending on their population being able to sustain whatever suffering Putin imposes upon them?
Well, let me give you a big answer here. There's a real danger in reducing complexity to a question of good or bad. The reality is that there are many, many reasons why this conflict took place, and the map that you showed at the beginning could well have been the map of Ukraine's electoral politics in 2012. Russia has basically staked, and Putin has staked in particular, his political future on this project. If he loses, then there's a big question mark in terms of what happens internally to Russia. For Ukraine, the question is really whether or not they can win by simply not losing. And that's the question that we're all going to be facing. But there's no doubt that we're right now in what Russia sees as a global war, where the weaponization of all is going to be part of what they see as an existential fight over the future of what they see as being Russian civilization. And that's a big question and a big challenge for Ukraine and all of us to have to deal with.
I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your very eminent views on what is the one of the most tragic stories of our time. Alexander Winoshka from the University of Waterloo, Stephanie Carvin, Carleton University, Rafal Rohozinski from CIGI. Thanks so much to the three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.